Imagine stepping into a world where silk rustles in the shadows, where flickering candlelight hides as much as it reveals. A world where power and poverty, devotion and desire, sin and salvation all collide under the same cathedral bells. Now, ask yourself, what if the women everyone whispered about, the women branded as fallen, were in fact some of the most powerful players in medieval society? Tonight, we're pulling back the velvet curtain on a story that history books often tried to bury. We're diving into the hidden history of the medieval courtesans, women caught between reverence and disgrace, survival and scandal. Their lives were far more complicated, more dangerous, and perhaps more influential than you've ever been told. But before we step into their world, let me ask you, what would you sacrifice for survival? Wealth, freedom, your reputation? Keep that question in mind, because as we journey through the shadows of medieval Europe, you'll see how these women were forced to gamble with all three. And trust me, the truth might shock you. If stories like this fascinate you, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And of course, subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter of this hidden history. In the bustling medieval cities of Europe, not everything was cathedrals and kings. Behind the noise of markets and the clang of blacksmith hammers, another world thrived. Secret, glittering, dangerous. It was here, in candle-lit chambers and lavish feasting halls, that the courtesans appeared. Most were not born into luxury. Many were the daughters of struggling farmers or artisans, pushed to the margins by poverty, famine, or family misfortune. For them, the life of a courtesan was both a curse and a lifeline. On one hand, it offered the promise of fine clothes, silver coins, and access to the powerful. On the other, it carried the heavy shadow of shame, judgment, and abandonment. Imagine being a teenage girl, just 13, maybe 14, suddenly thrust into this world. At an age when modern kids are barely starting high school, young women of the Middle Ages were being dressed in velvet gowns, painted with rouge, and paraded before wealthy patrons who would decide their worth. Entry into this hidden circle wasn't as simple as knocking on the right door. It often began with a presentation to a potential patron, a nobleman, a wealthy merchant, or even a bishop's. The girl would be scrutinized not just for her beauty, but for her wit, her charm, her ability to recite poetry or discuss politics. Because in this secret economy of desire, looks opened the door, but intelligence kept it from closing. Behind them, pulling the strings, were older women, former courtesans who had survived long enough to become mentors. They taught the art of conversation, the delicate dance of seduction, the subtle ways to flatter a powerful man without appearing desperate. It was a school of survival, a curriculum written in silk and secrets. Their youth itself was a currency. Society expected them to begin their careers between the ages of 13 and 16, an idea that might horrify us today. But in the medieval world, it was not only accepted, it was expected. With every passing year, their value in the marketplace of desire diminished, so they had to learn fast. They had to master the games of influence, to smile when they wanted to scream, to flatter men who could just as easily destroy them as they could elevate them. These women lived in a paradox. On one side, they were admired, invited to the most glittering feasts and courts, praised for their beauty and grace. On the other side, the church thundered against them from the pulpit, branding them as sinners and corrupters. Imagine sitting in a crowded cathedral, hearing the priest thunder about the shame of women like you, only to see that very priest slip into your chamber under cover of darkness later that night. They had wealth, they had influence, but they also carried a burden that could crush them at any moment. And just when you think you understand the precarious balance of their world, another, darker reality appears, one that strikes at the heart of every mother's deepest fear. But what happened when these women bore children? Children society never wanted to exist. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. You are 15 years old, draped in velvet and pearls that don't belong to you, sitting in the candlelit chamber of a nobleman twice your age. You've been trained to smile, to pour his wine, to flatter his ego. But then, weeks later, you realize you carry his child. What happens now? For a medieval courtesan, pregnancy was both a miracle and a curse. On the one hand, bearing the child of a wealthy man could, in rare cases, secure protection or even elevate her position. But far more often, the child was seen as a burden, a threat to her allure, and a dangerous liability in a society obsessed with bloodlines and legitimacy. Most of these children were hidden away. Some were given to monasteries or convents, raised without ever knowing their true parentage. Others were left at foundling homes, stone towers with small openings where a baby could be placed anonymously, almost like a secret confession. Imagine the heartbreak, cradling your infant in your arms, kissing its forehead, and then placing it into a cold wooden turnstile, knowing you may never see it again. And yet, many courtesans had no choice. Their survival depended on appearances. A swollen belly or a child clinging to their skirts could mean the end of their income. Clients sought beauty, youth, and mystery, not motherhood. But the costs of their profession went far beyond lost children. The very luxuries that made them desirable, the shimmering gowns, the scented oils, the jewels that glittered in firelight, were also chains. Maintaining this image was expensive. Every gold coin earned was quickly spent on silks imported from Venice, on musicians to liven a banquet, on servants to project an air of grandeur. It was a vicious cycle. To attract wealthy patrons, you needed wealth already. And so many courtesans found themselves in constant debt, forced to gamble with their future just to keep up appearances. And through it all, the eyes of the church bore down on them. Priests thundered that women like you were agents of the devil, the very embodiment of sin. Your name might be spat from the pulpit, even as those same holy men sought your company in private. The hypocrisy was staggering, admired in secret, condemned in public. Do you see the paradox now? Courtesans were both celebrated and shunned. They could sway the decisions of kings, whispering advice in moments that changed the fate of nations. Some were skilled in poetry, philosophy, even diplomacy, talents that earned them access to courts and councils where ordinary women were never allowed. And yet at the same time, their lives balanced on a knife's edge. One slip, one scandal too many, and the same society that had praised their beauty would cast them aside without mercy. But this isn't the end of their story. In fact, what came next was even more dangerous. Because as the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, the rules of power, morality, and survival were rewritten. Imagine yourself seated at a grand banquet table, golden goblets glinting in the candlelight. Knights boast of their battles, merchants brag about their riches, and lords whisper about alliances that could change kingdoms. Amid them all, you, a courtesan, adorned in silk and jewels, lean in to whisper something clever to a powerful duke. The room erupts in laughter at your wit, and for a brief moment, you are not a cast-off, not a sinner, but the star of the evening. This was one of the greatest paradoxes of the medieval courtesan. Though condemned in church sermons, she was often welcomed in the very halls where decisions about wars, taxes, and marriages were made. Powerful men did not just seek beauty in these women. They craved conversation, intellect, and the subtle influence that only a courtesan could provide. Some of these women became confidants to kings and counselors to bishops. They listened when noblemen raged about rivals, and they whispered strategies that could tilt the balance of power. It's easy to forget that in a society where most women were silenced, courtesans wielded a weapon sharper than any sword: their voice. But don't mistake influence for security. Their place was never guaranteed. One rumor, one jealous rival, one shift in fashion, and everything could come crashing down. Courtesans lived in a constant state of performance, even in private. They studied poetry not for the love of art, but because a witty quote from Ovid could keep a patron enthralled. They learned the subtle art of listening, nodding at just the right moment, laughing at jokes they didn't always find funny. Now picture yourself in this role. Every smile you give is calculated, every glance a weapon, every word chosen to disarm or seduce. The feast may end in laughter and applause, but as you walk home under the cover of darkness, the stares from ordinary townsfolk burn into your back. To them, you are not a celebrated beauty. You are a sinner, an outcast, a dangerous woman who tempts men from their faith. And yet, isn't there something hauntingly powerful about that? These women, often dismissed as fallen, were in fact shaping the very course of history from the shadows. They had no crowns, no thrones, no armies, but they had influence, and in a world ruled by fragile egos and endless ambition, influence could be more dangerous than steel. Still, time is merciless. Beauty fades. The young girls who had once been the jewels of medieval courts grew older. New faces arrived, younger, fresher, more enticing. What happens to a woman whose entire life has been built on youth and desire when time begins to erase both? Many courtesans, stripped of their patrons and their wealth, ended their lives in obscurity. Some found themselves in convents, forced into repentance. Others fell into poverty, forgotten by the very men who once swore eternal devotion. Their decline was often as swift as their rise. One day dining beside princes, the next begging for bread. But not all accepted this fate. Some, the most cunning, the most adaptable, found ways to survive. They reinvented themselves, becoming matchmakers, spies, or even political brokers in the shifting world of Renaissance Europe. These were the women who understood that true power was never about beauty alone. And here's where the story twists again. Because just as society was changing, so too was the church. The coming of the Reformation and the rise of the bourgeoisie challenged the old order. The courtesan's role, once an open secret of power, was now seen as a scandal to be purged. So, what became of those who dared to cling to their influence, even as the world turned against them? As the 15th century bled into the dawn of the Renaissance, the courtesan's golden age began to dim. The same society that once invited them into palaces now started closing its doors. Why? Because Europe itself was changing. The rise of the bourgeois class shifted power away from feudal lords. The Protestant Reformation thundered across the continent, denouncing corruption, condemning immorality, and calling for a stricter vision of piety. And at the center of this storm stood the courtesans, easy targets for sermons, scapegoats for society's sins. Imagine the fear. One day, you're adorned in emerald silk, playing music for a prince. The next, you hear whispers that the bishop has called for a crackdown on women of loose virtue. The same men who once sought your company now avert their eyes in public, pretending they don't know you. Their wives, who once tolerated your existence as part of the court's hidden machinery, now demand your expulsion. But here's the twist. Despite the condemnation, many courtesans had already left their mark on history. Some had whispered secrets that shaped treaties between rival kingdoms. Others had advised rulers on matters of war, taxation, or diplomacy. Their influence lived on in the decisions of kings, the rise and fall of noble houses, even the fate of nations. And yet, their names were often erased, their contributions buried under layers of shame. The end of a courtesan's life was rarely glamorous. When youth and beauty faded, many were abandoned, left without money, home, or family. A handful found refuge in convents, trading silks for sackcloth. Others slipped into poverty, surviving on the edge of society, their once celebrated names spoken only as warnings to young girls. It was a cruel irony. The very women who had lived in opulence often died in silence, forgotten by those they had once entertained. But not all stories ended in tragedy. Some courtesans were cunning enough to transform themselves into something more enduring. They became patrons of the arts, collectors of knowledge, and even secret diplomats. In Renaissance Italy, for example, famous courtesans like Tullia d'Aragona and Veronica Franco published poetry that still survives today. They used the very talents they had once employed to seduce noblemen to carve out a legacy in literature and culture. For a brief moment, society allowed them to shine not just for their beauty, but for their brilliance. And yet, for every courtesan who managed to secure her place in history, countless others were lost to time. Their names vanished, their children absorbed into convents or abandoned to the streets, their stories erased because they didn't fit the neat moral lessons the church wanted to tell. So let me ask you this. When you hear the word courtesan, do you think of sin and scandal? Or do you see survivors, strategists, and perhaps even silent power brokers who shaped the course of medieval Europe from the shadows? The truth is, the lives of medieval courtesans were not simply tales of lust or shame. They were complex, tragic, and often brilliant stories of women navigating impossible choices in a world built to control them. And maybe that's why history tried to forget them, because their very existence revealed the hypocrisy at the heart of medieval society. Their beauty faded, but their legacy still lingers. In poems, in whispered legends, and in the questions they force us to ask about power, morality, and survival. So, what do you think? Were these women villains, victims, or visionaries trapped in the wrong century? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you want more stories like this, filled with the raw, hidden history that textbooks often ignore, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. Because this was only one glimpse into a forgotten world. And trust me, the Middle Ages still have countless secrets waiting to be uncovered.